Hi everyone, and welcome to Free Speech, Debunking the Myths at the Imagine Festival Belfast. I'm going to introduce everyone on the panel with me today. We're all going to talk about some of the biggest myths involved in the free speech debate. And I've got a great lineup of experts here to thrash out some of these issues on the topic. So first of all, we have Sarah Mazouz. Sarah received her PhD in sociology in 2010 and is currently a researcher at the French National Centre for Scientific Research. Her areas of research include anti-discrimination policy in Europe, citizenship policy in France and Germany, critical race theory, sociology of law, and the anthropology of the state. She is the author of La République, ces autres, and the co-author of Pour l'intersectionalité. I'm also joined by Gavin Titley, a senior lecturer in the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth University and a docent in the Swedish School of Social Science at the University of Helsinki, the author of Is Free Speech Racist? Racism and the Media, After Charlie Hebdo, Terror, Racism and Free Speech, and The Crises of Multiculturalism, Racism in a Neoliberal Age, which he co-authored with Alana Lenton. I'm also joined by Lorna Finlayson, a political philosopher and writer who has published works including The Political is Political, Conformity and the Illusion of Dissent in Contemporary Political Philosophy, and an introduction to feminism. She's also published numerous articles in The Guardian and The New Left View, among others. And finally, myself, I am Suzanne Witten. I am also a political philosopher. I completed my PhD in 2019 at Queen's University Belfast, and my monograph, A Republican Theory of Free Speech, was published at the end of last year by Palgrave Macmillan. And I thank you all for joining me today to talk about freedom of speech. So to start us off, a bit of an introduction question. I'm going to direct it to Lorna. What is free speech and why do you think it's so important?
Well, I think there's a lot more agreement on its being important than there is on what it actually is. I think more or less everybody across political divides claims to think it's important, at least. And they give a number of reasons for that. One of the sort of classic liberal just reasons given is that if you have freedom of speech, then truth will kind of rise and flourish on a marketplace of ideas. And I think maybe that's one of the less convincing justifications for it. But I think there are better ones, like a general interest that we all have in not being dominated and being able to exercise our agency, and that applying to our speech as well. And also more negatively, with the in the absence of any trustworthy authority that we could somehow delegate the policing of our speech to. I think those are both good reasons for valuing freedom of speech. As to the question of what it is, I think, as I say, there's much less consensus on that. I think there's a dominant view, but the dominant view is itself not very clear. And I sometimes think of that as the thin conception of freedom of speech, because it basically says you have free speech if nobody comes in and stops you from saying what you want to say. And that usually means stops you by the law or stops you by force from saying what you want to say. And that looks like it's simple, but of course, once you start to pick at the details, it rapidly becomes less simple. Like what counts exactly as force, what counts as a sufficiently severe penalty that we should say that somebody's been stopped from speaking in a given case. Because in practice, we don't normally have cases where somebody actually clamps a hand over your mouth when you try to say something. So that's the thin conception. But there's also another conception that I think is more openly complicated, which I just call the thick conception by way of contrast. And that basically says that freedom of speech is what you might call speech power. It's the power that we have to do things with our words. And I think at that point, some people might think, well, that's not really about freedom of speech because nobody has a right to be taken seriously. Nobody has a right to influence people and to do those things with their words. But I think there is something relevant to freedom of speech here, because there's also scope for us to be impeded at this level, at the level of our speech power. So, for example, if I go around and I tell everybody that you're a compulsive liar, then I haven't stopped you from making words, I haven't stopped you from speaking, but I have blocked the belief that people will have in what you're saying. I have made it the case that you won't be believed. So I think there is reason to kind of expand the scope of what we really mean by freedom of speech. I think I could go on about this for too long, but I just wanted to make one more kind of point about this, which is that one of the things that I think is weird about the discourse around freedom of speech is that people don't tend to define exactly what they mean by it. And then what tends to happen is they might switch between the thin and the thick conception as is convenient to whatever it is that they want to argue. And it roughly goes like this. The right wing operate with a thin conception of speech, and they won't have any truck with anybody coming along and saying, well, I'm being silenced by somebody saying nasty things about me or the group that I belong to. They'll say, that's not silencing, pull yourself together. It's only silencing when it's really censorship. But then as soon as somebody criticizes them for being, say, racist, they scream about free speech and say, I'm being silenced, I'm being silenced. So they've flipped from the thin to the thick conception of speech without really, free speech without really signaling it. And then equally on the left, I think there's a similar flip that happens in that on the left will often be more open to a thicker conception which takes into account relations of power. If you're in a stigmatized group, maybe you won't be taken seriously, maybe you won't have access to platforms, your power to do things with your speech will be less. But then as soon as you get into an argument with the right, when the right, for example, are complaining about being silenced or cancelled, will be quick to say, well, that's not really silencing because you haven't actually been barred from saying what you want to say. And I think that response is too quick, and the flipping between the two is somewhat disingenuous.
Good, thank you. I think that's really interesting, the way in which you describe the thick and the thin conception, and the way different ends of the political spectrum flip between the two. I think you're absolutely right there. And that kind of leads us to a similar discussion point, which is about not so much free speech, but the debate about free speech itself. So Gavin, if I could ask you, why do you think there's so much debate or talk about free speech in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. I mean, I think this is really an interesting question, and it's a really pertinent one right now. And I think the way, Lorna laid out this sort of landscape of speech, if you like, is very crucial to understanding, what's going on with debates about free speech in societies. In many societies right now, many political contexts, there are reasonably similar debates about freedom of speech and its value and its limits and so forth. I think that, there's a number of ways we could cut into it. I'm, as you introduced, I'm in the media studies department. So one of the things that always strikes me in debates about freedom of speech is that most of the debate is about the freedom bit, and there's much less about the speech, actually thinking about speech as communication and something that involves relations, it involves media, it involves contexts and so on. And so one of the things, if we look at the societies where there's a very loud debate about freedom of speech right now, they're societies of abundant communication. There's more communication than we know how to process. We talk about questions of infoglut or information overload, all of these kinds of things. So we could look to put these two things, if you like, in relation to each other. On the one hand, there appears to be sort of irrational amounts, abundant amounts of speech and communication. And on the other hand, there's a very loud debate about the limits of freedom of speech. And I think the two go together. Now, what I don't mean by this is to say that the fact that, social media has allowed for people to participate in very uneven and very limited and sometimes very troubling ways in public discourse is a kind of an abundance that removes restrictions on speech. Obviously, it doesn't. One of the things we might get into later on is that when we look at social media platforms, we have entirely private corporations of global standing who have no democratic oversight, who can decide how speech is organized in very, very profound ways with political consequences at micro and macro scales and so on. So I just want to make that clear. That's not what I'm talking about here. But what I am talking about is that we need to find a way of explaining why so many people are talking about being silenced or talking about a crisis of freedom of speech under these particular media and political kinds of conditions. And I think there's a number of things going on. I think one is, just to give an example briefly, there was many people watching this or listening may have seen a New York Times editorial last week written by the editorial board, which is an unusual statement, attempt at a kind of authoritative statement. And they were writing about, the United States having a free speech crisis. And one of the things that they said is, in the very first paragraph, is that many Americans, they conducted some kind of poll, which had a lot of problems with it, but many Americans believe that, to quote, they can no longer speak their mind without fear of being shamed or being shunned or some such consequence. Now, I think they were immediately criticized, and rightly so, for expressing this as a right. There's never been any right not to be shamed or shunned or to have any kind of virulence aimed at you according to what you say. But I think what they inadvertently did was capture what's at stake in the first instance with this free speech crisis, which is that we have very unruly and messy and yet still very unequal publics. And one of the things that has happened as a consequence of that is the sort of the rules of the game, what constitutes sort of civility, what it means to feel like you're being heard, what it is to be taken seriously. All of these kinds of things are in flux to a certain extent. And it's no accident, I think, that a lot of this free speech crisis discourse comes from people who institutionally, culturally, have had a particular kind of elite position where the rules of the game have not just been very clear to them, but have benefited them in particular ways. So there's a kind of a sense of a kind of republic of letters where we know how to engage with each other and circulate ideas, but, people have roughed this up and messed this up, and it's impinging on not just our right to speak, but the quality of the speech. And I think speech broadly understood, those things kind of go very closely together. So that's one thing I think we need to come back to. What constitutes sort of public discourse, how it should be conducted, is something which is in, it's in flux, let's say, to a certain extent. The second thing I think is that this situation benefits a particular kind of performance, and it's a political performance, but it's a performance that benefits from kind of media, the media context, and Lorna alluded to it when she was talking about very high profile people being silenced, which is that there's a certain kind of contrarianism which is dependent on the fact that actually our publics are very fragmented. Many people who are looking for audiences, who are looking for, if you like, a cohort to communicate to, are looking to communicate with that segment of the public and that segment of the public only. They want to be convincing to that segment of the public only, who are going to buy their books or who share their ideology. And they're not that interested, even if they talk in the language of freedom of speech, which presupposes a kind of public sphere of democratic intent. They're not that interested actually in speaking to anyone outside of that. So the idea of constantly presenting oneself as being silenced is a performance that allows you to gain attention in a context where attention and competition for attention is very, very intense indeed. And it's no accident that a lot of these people are nationalists or far-right actors, because it also allows them to speak from a position of victimhood. And we know that, nationalist politics is most comfortable when it can speak from a position of erasure, that we are going to be victims of this. And then I think, lastly, yes, there's a lot of intolerances created by these public conditions, and maybe we can come back to that later on. I think Lorna is right that we must not flip the script too quickly when it comes to thinking about sort of right versus left critiques. But I just start with those two ideas: the notion of the public as it is right now, and who it's benefiting in particular ways under certain media and political conditions.
Thank you. And following on from that, and that this is directed towards the group, do you think then, and maybe we will thrash this out a little bit throughout the course of the session, do you think it is possible in some sense to distinguish between free speech and free speech rhetoric?
I think it definitely is, to the extent that they're almost the opposite of each other. I think one of the characteristics of what I think of as ideological forms of thought, by which I mean forms of thought that are distorted in a way that's non-accidental and kind of politically convenient, is that they often get things not only wrong but backwards. And I think the discourse around free speech is really a case in point, that it's not just that the people who claim to be free speech warriors and are always talking about free speech, it's not just that they're selective about this. It's true that they're selective about it. There's a well-known Palestine exception for free speech. You're allowed to have free speech on anything but the criticism of Israel, for example. But it's not just that it's selective, I think. It's also more stark than that, at least in the context of the UK, because some of the same people, some of the government in particular, who are weaponizing the rhetoric of free speech are also the ones who are absolutely clamping down on it. And I don't really mean in a kind of slightly expanded, thick sense of the term. I mean, even in the thin sense of the term, they're clamping down on it. They're criminalizing protest. So And maybe the kind of absolute peak of this is the free speech bill that's going to affect universities, which is called a free speech bill, but actually the content of it is such that it's going to reduce the freedom that academics and students have to decide who they can invite to speak, really, and what the terms of that discussion are going to be. So it's the opposite of what it says it is.
Yes, those are all brilliant points. I want to kind of, feed off from that a little bit and talk about this flipping that occurs and the way in which people get things backwards. Do you think, of course there will be people with bad intentions involved in all of this, that they know that what they're doing is trying to exert power or influence over the public discourse and the speech situation. But do you think for a lot of other people, they're not so aware that this is what they're doing? There are people acting in good faith who really are confused about whether they're endorsing a thin or a thick conception.
Is it okay to come back on that? So I think yeah, there's definitely more than just bad faith. I'm sure there's plenty of bad faith around, but I think there is genuine confusion because the concept of free speech is quite confused and confusing. And I think maybe one thing I didn't mention before when I was talking about the question of what free speech is that's important here is there's a kind of elephant in the room, I think, which is that we all would like to think of free speech as somehow a kind of cross-political or even politically neutral principle. So there's a gap between endorsement of the content of some speech and defense of the right that someone has to say it. There's the famous Voltaire line about, I hate what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it. Or it's not actually a quote from him, but whatever. It's often talked about. So on the one hand, it's perfectly true. There is a gap between what we think people have a right to say and what we will agree with. But to think that there is this kind of apolitical notion of free speech that we can agree on, I think is a mistake. And I think that mistake accounts for a lot of the confusion. And I think that we can see it as a mistake once we expand what we mean by freedom of speech and we start thinking about informal things like smearing. I think Gavin mentions shunning, and that's a good example because on the one hand, there is no freedom from objection. As I think Nesreen Malik put it, there's no freedom not to be criticised or not to be disliked for what you say. There's no freedom from counter-speech or protest. But at the same time, I don't think it's implausible to say that when there is a smear, when there is something that's actually said about someone, like you're a liar, and it's not true, you're not Boris Johnson, you actually aren't a liar, right? Or when you're cast as an anti-Semite for criticising Israel, that does seem to me to be plausibly a threat to freedom of speech. But I think what that goes to show is that you can't fully detach the kind of what we might call first order political judgments we're making from the judgments we're making about the politics of free speech. And I think the kind of failure to see that might account for a lot of the confusion in that area.
Thank you. Gavin, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I may, Susanna, I think that's a really crucial point. I think that excuse me, another way of maybe thinking about this confusion is that there's a very important difference between the way freedom of speech is often imagined in public debate and our experience of speech as communication. And that we, there's particularly, let's say in something like this New York Times editorial, there's two things goes on. One is a very disembodied speaker is imagined as the holder of the right to free speech, who expresses their conscience, and that's the key sort of move as to autonomy that Lorna was talking about earlier. And their conscience, when they speak, it's an expression of their conscience, and it just kind of comes out into the world, and this is speech, and it sort of runs along until it hits some kind of barrier. And some of those barriers are legitimate, like law, others are not, and that's where censorship or the slippery slope takes place, and so on. So there's a way in which this sort of maximalist notion of freedom of speech dominates public debate in ways that I think most people can't recognize in their experience of speech and communication, because we don't, as speakers, as social beings that communicate, regardless of our sort of linguistic capacities or communicative capacities, we don't experience this undifferentiated abstract thing called speech. We experience situated speech relationships. And these happen within intimate relationships. They happen in public. They happen in institutional settings. They happen, if we're in a media context like this, they happen within particular formats that govern and shape the way in which we communicate. So we are used to communicating in contexts where there's some kind of relationship between possibility and participation and forms of restriction and the kinds of forms of soft or, legal but dubious coercion that Lorna was talking about. So in other words, our experience of speech is very, very uneven when it comes to questions of coercion, limitation, possibility. If we take that to the political level, just to kind of refer again to what Lorna was saying, one of the things that characterizes free speech debates is the question of which issues can claim the status of a freedom of speech issue. Because there are multiple issues constantly and multiple subjects, people, political actors of many kinds that constantly suffer some form of repression or coercion or restriction on their speech. But there's a handful of issues which tend to, if you like, be able to claim the framework of being a freedom of speech issue. When that happens outside of, let's say, outside of the West, it tends to be around sort of obviously very sort of violent forms of repression, for example, the targeting of journalists, as we've seen lately, that kind of thing. When it happens in the societies that we tend to be talking about in this discussion, it's again around these kind of quite nebulous forms of debate as to whether I'm being silenced or marginalized or no platformed or not. And the only way to understand them is to really be quite empirical and to go into different cases and see what's happening and see what the relations and the power relations in the history of them are and so forth. So I think that the way in which freedom of speech is talked about and the fact that it's not connected to other forms of power, it's rarely, we seem to think that if we talk about speech as something which is contextual, we're relativizing it, we're not being, sufficiently loyal to this principle. And yet when we think about communication, we can't communicate outside of context. It shapes what we do, it forms what we do. And I think that needs to be our starting point, particularly if we want to look at the ways in which claims for silencing are made across different venues, across different institutions, across different areas of life.
Okay, thank you. And that leads us nicely to the next question that I have here, which is about a particular context in which people believe free speech should be protected at all costs, and that is the university, right? And you often see in discussions about free speech at university a lot of talk about academic freedom, but of course academic freedom and free speech are quite different things. So what do you three as a group think about this issue? Why do you think that there is such confusion about the difference between academic freedom and free speech more generally?
May I answer?
Yes.
Taking from the French case, I think, we can observe a kind of paradoxical situation in the case of France, because people who are using like the rhetoric of free speech are also those who cannot bear not to have the last word. But what we can also notice now is that there's a kind of paradoxical situation, because people who claim that free speech is threatened want at the same time to limit academic freedom or even work to implement new regulations to limit this freedom. So, for example, in the autumn of 2020 in France, there was a proposal of amendment to the general law reforming public university. And this amendment wanted to introduce a requirement of conformity of studies in social science, especially, to so-called Republican values. And so the amendment wasn't eventually accepted, but it was an unprecedented attempt to make academic research under political control, and it was supported by the group who was at the same time saying that there was a problem with critical race theory, with intersectionality, etc., within the university, because this kind of research or approaches were threatening the freedom of speech. And what we can also observe in this whole, situation is that there's a kind of tendency to oversimplify or to reduce any debate, especially on on race, for example, or about academic freedom on a position between pros and cons, without asking the question of the expertise of both sides. And I think it has also to do with academic freedom, because in this kind of both-sidist context, we don't give its importance to those who are their importance to those who are supposed to be like the experts. And they are just confronted to people who might be, in some cases, also academics, but not specialists of the issue. And they just come and let us know what they think. But it is not a real debate between people who work on an issue and just after not agreeing. So that's what I would say about this, this tricky situation on academic freedom.
Thanks, Sarah. It sounds like a very similar situation to Ireland and Britain, if I say so myself. And what's really interesting is what you say in terms of who is invited to the table to talk about a particular issue. That's definitely something that we are seeing in the UK. I'm not so sure about Ireland, but someone is kind of given authority on a subject because of their position within a university rather than their expertise on a topic. I mean, it's great to have lots of different voices involved, but when we're talking about the quality of discourse, it is, of course, important to look at who is involved in these discussions. Did Lorna or Gavin want to jump in on the issue of academic freedom, perhaps in your own particular contexts?
Sure, I can contribute something. Lorna, I saw your microphone. We unmiked at exactly the same time, so it's like paper, scissors, stone or something.
You go.
You want to go ahead, or
you go first?
Okay. I mean, just to say, I think this is a really important one, and what Sarah has said is very important, because I think, as is often the case, France is the sort of laboratory of repression and resistance on this issue in some ways at the moment. But just, I might take a step back to the question, Suzanne, around the relationship between academic freedom, first of all, and freedom of speech. And I think that one of the things that's happening, or one of the reasons why academic freedom is so linked to freedom of speech in these contemporary crisis debates, there's clearly political agendas around this, and we can get to them. But one aspect, again, when we go back to questions, if you like, of public confusion, is that they're often treated as sort of related to each other on a spectrum, that academic freedom is a kind of a rarefied version or a particular contextual version of freedom of speech. And in fact, as Sarah pointed out, it's a lot more complicated than that. Let's take a very simple example. If I give a lecture, academic freedom allows me to explore within the contours of my discipline and the subjects that I'm engaging with, allows me to explore all of the perspectives on that which have been researched and written about and which have been presented without arbitrary intervention and without consequences for doing so. But it doesn't allow me to stand up at the podium and talk about whatever I would want to do. In other words, to simply exercise my freedom of speech. So there are all kinds of obvious ways in which they're not the same thing. But I think that there are ways in which they are also evidently, or dominant understandings of them are evidently in conflict with each other. And this also goes in some ways for some of the wider public dynamics we were talking about, which is that there's a conflict, you could say, between a particular notion of openness, which is that public discourse should always circulate all of the ideas. And that's what allows for democratic health, this sort of hapless marketplace of ideas metaphor that Lorna was talking about earlier. Whereas what you have in universities, of course, are systems of closure, often very conservative ones, sometimes very reflective and pedagogically astute ones, but they're systems of closure. We make decisions as to what goes into a discussion, as to what goes onto a module. And that means excluding lots of things that don't go into that discussion and lots of ideas that don't go into that module. So the idea that academic freedom is simply allowing all of the perspectives on a certain topic to circulate is to misunderstand what academic freedom is about. It's always been about the empowerment within the context of the university to make certain decisions and enforce certain kinds of closures. Now, when we look at some of the debates like this in the United States, for example, we can see how this plays out in political terms. There's an awful lot of groups, well-funded groups, active in the media, active in and through their websites. You can see how well funded they are, who are pushing notions such as viewpoint diversity, saying the idea that lots of issues are not being debated in universities anymore because universities have become too woke, they've become too politically correct, they've become they're too enthralled to identity politics. They won't consider all of the debates anymore. And so what they can do on the internet, of course, is engage in maximal openness. They can circulate the same kind of ideas again. And it's no accident that these ideas are often ideas which come from, 20th century histories of eugenics or racial science or races taught more generally or whatever it might be. They circulate them again and again, and they say, why can't we just have a debate about this in universities? But it's not the role of universities, and it's not the purveyance of academic freedom to facilitate a debate on all of this stuff. It is actually to make choices. And the way in which we talk about things in seminars, for example, does not sort of map onto this model of debating everything and everybody putting all of these ideas out there, no matter how offensive and no matter how controversial. That's not a model of pedagogy or learning, and hasn't really been one for an awful long time, apart from in certain kinds of elite venues or certain ideas of how these elite venues function. So there's all kinds of ways in which these are in conflict. But the point that Sarah's making is that that's being weaponized now at the moment in ways which are designed to make it look as if universities, in doing imperfectly and under very, very difficult conditions in many cases, the things they're meant to be doing, or university staff rather, not the institutions themselves, that they're somehow anti-free speech. And that's a very deliberate and very dangerous collapse.
Thanks, Gavin. Lorna, did you want to add to your earlier point?
There's a sort of stack of points. There's so much to say about this. I think I basically agree with Gavin in that the impression that people get, especially from outside of universities, is often pretty much the opposite, once again, of what's really, really going on. And so you end up often in frustrating discussions with friends or aunts or whatever, who kind of have this impression that this thing is going on and people aren't allowed to say perfectly reasonable things without, being fired, and it's really terrible. And then, you have to explain that, yes, it would be terrible if that was happening, but actually this is very, very far from what's really going on. I don't know. I mean, I think, again, it's something that is confected. It's confected by people and political forces who demonstrably don't care about freedom of speech because they're actually quite busy eroding it every day. I mean, I mentioned before the crime and policing bill. Well, I mean, this literally criminalizes people for being annoying at a protest, even if there's just one of you and you're considered to be noisy or causing considerable annoyance, I think is a phrase of that kind. So they're not friends of free speech. And these rows about free speech in universities are absolutely whipped up for political purposes. And it's noticeable that they always focus on the mob of the woke students. They don't focus on what is the bigger threat to freedom of speech in universities, which is, of course, managerial control, the fact that you're not really allowed to say certain things about your university in public, otherwise you risk being disciplined. The prevent agenda, which perhaps Gavin can say more about, but has for a while, I think similar to the situation in France, been placing a duty on academics to uphold, British values in certain ways and to take due steps to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. But of course, then there are reams of documentation on what due steps involves. Unfortunately, you can't say, yes, I'm already doing that, nothing, go away. So there are these huge threats to freedom of speech, I think, and academic freedom in universities, but they're not coming from the student mob largely. As with most right-wing sort of bits of ideology, there are grains of truth in it, and I wouldn't want to deny that. There are certain sorts of oversensitive, knee-jerk forms of politics that do take root sometimes amongst students. But I think the idea that that's where the main threat to free speech is coming from is substantially false. And I think the notion of no platform is a good example of that, because once again, there's loads of discussion about no platform and how terrible it is, but very little attention to the question of what no platform actually is. And when you look at that, it turns out that it's a tactic that's been going on since the 70s. And it basically involves student unions getting together and democratically, collectively deciding that we won't ask people from a very short list of organisations, most of which are prescribed in law anyway, we won't invite them to come and use the university as a platform. Well, I mean, once again, according to the thin conception of free speech, that is just an exercise of collective decision-making, and there's no violation of free speech there whatsoever. No one's been stopped from speaking, no one's entitled to a platform, and yet you get this confused kind of uproar about how this is the death of free speech.
Thanks, Lorna. Gavin or Sarah, do you want to jump in on any of those issues? No? Sarah, I was interested actually in asking a little bit more about the French context, and in particular the pushback against critical race theory. So this is something that's also happening, across the US, and I haven't seen too much of it yet in the UK. No doubt it will migrate over here very soon. What do you think about this? From your perspective as a teacher and as a scholar of critical race theory, have you been surprised by the sudden attention being given to the issue in the media?
I mean, I was surprised because it became like a very kind of public issue. But there were elements before preparing. I mean, the way in which the whole debate is framed is not that surprising, although it's surprising to see the importance that it has now in this very special context. But maybe to make things clearer to our audience, there are two kinds of attacks against critical race theory, intersectionality, etc. You've got attacks from within the university, and you have also, and they are more recent, attacks coming from outside the academia, from reactionary newspapers as well as public personalities known for their right-wing or reactionary positions, or at least their Republican conservatism, so to say. So what is very different now is that you have people, members, politician members of the government, such as the ministers in charge of education or the one in charge of research and university, who took also position against these studies and also presented them as, the cause of all the problems, and especially terror, that they were feeding Islamist terrorism. So it was like also this very unexpected link made between critical race theory and terrorism, for example. But so these polemics were fueled by the political class, and they have been prepared for years by reactionary newspapers and magazines. And as I've just said, they have been expressed more recently, especially by members of the Macron government in the autumn of 2020. After President Macron himself introduced the issue in June 2020, when he said, in the context of the huge anti-racist demonstration led in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, that a certain kind of anti-racism might be considered as a threat to the French Republic because it will introduce a kind of division within the political body and the society. And then after the appalling beheading of the teacher Samuel Paty, the Minister of Education said that intersectionality feeds terrorism, and that the person who murdered this teacher was supposed to have read intersectionality, which is absolutely nonsense. But nevertheless, from that moment on, we had different things, like also the intervention of Frédérique Vidal, who is the Minister of University and Research, who said that there was, she warned against the cancer-like spread of Islamo-leftism within French academia. So it is also important to notice that race is, for those politicians, an attractive issue because it helps to mobilize against, a kind of common enemy supposed to instigate division and conflict within French society. But what is also maybe important to highlight is that all this, the phenomena that all this, several political and mediatic outcries aim to combat are not entirely clear. Sometimes it is intersectionality, sometimes it is post-colonial studies, Sometimes it is the colonial studies, etc. So, and sometimes it might be even the practice of inclusive writing, which is in French the way to write that also feminize all the spelling and the word. So, it's like a very kind of patchwork of different enemy to what is supposed to be the right Republican position. The other kind of a position is maybe more ancient and older, and it comes from within the social science, and it is between, scientists who claim that social class has primacy and see race and to a certain extent gender as a US importation that are not relevant to analyze how inequality is produced in France. But what these two positions share is the negation of systemic racism, kind of tendency to downplay racism in France, and to artificially oppose France and the United States on the matter of race and slavery, with two missions, which is doing as if France had no slaves and has no a kind of colonial history, and presenting everything as coming from the US. Maybe I have a too long response on it. I'm going
No, not at all. That was incredibly interesting and informative, and you touched on quite a few things that I was going to bring in anyway, including perhaps the fear that the discussion of some of these theories in universities leads to an increase in terrorism. So I wondered if one of the other two panellists wanted to perhaps expand on that in the context of the PREVENT strategy and how it relates to some of these issues.
Yeah, I can certainly respond to that. I just, if you don't mind, I would just add one thing which is quite incredible about the politics that Sarah is talking about, which is that, I think this is a really good example of, I think, what in different ways we've all been arguing, which is that to get at what's happening with the politics of free speech, we need to locate it. We can't just keep talking about sort of abstract principles as if these organize the way in which things actually happen in our society. So it's no accident, I think, there's an intensification of these debates after the global Black Lives Matter protests. So in the context of France, you particularly get this move which says that, to talk about race in France is an American importation, that race lives in the United States and we can see, the excesses of racism there, and therefore, but to bring that to France is to, insult the universalism of the Republic, but it's also to draw on, US kind of postmodern theory. Now, French Republicans mirror in this the way in which the US Republican Party after Trump has been talking about critical race theory, which is to say that Black Lives Matter protesters who have managed to, get their feet under the comfortable chairs in universities are drawing on French theory in order to divide the Republic, so they're kind of weird mirror of each other. But in both instances, the idea is that it's not that the societies themselves are riven with inequality and with conflicts which need to be historically understood, particularly in terms of, say, race and colonialism or race and slavery, but that it's theory from within universities which are not quite part of the societies, because there's something a little bit odd and exotic about them. It's the ideas being implemented on the societies which are causing division. So it's an extraordinary idealistic kind of notion as to what causes kind of political division. Of course, we know the reasons why it's being generated, as Sarah said. But it's the idea that the problems stem from the theories themselves, and the theories always come from somewhere else, which when you think about the roots of that kind of political thinking, it's extremely dangerous, actually, this notion that we're being polluted from ideas from somewhere else. It's just being expressed in these particular forms right now. I think you mentioned PREVENT, and I think it's a good thing to bring it back to that in the context of the UK, which is that let me again take one of these examples of the ways in which some things get to become freedom of speech issues and some things don't. As many people listening will know, there's been kind of a series of moral panics, particularly under successive Tory governments, about freedom of speech on British campuses. This actually started, I think, really in very concerted terms with Joe Johnson, Boris Johnson's brother, when he was university's minister. And he commissioned a kind of a cross-party Commons report on restrictions of political speech on campuses, and they came back and they found almost nothing. They found no evidence, if you like, of the various scandals that had been, featured in the Times and the Spectator and the Telegraph and the Mail for months and months and months preceding this. But at the same time as they were investigating this, staff in UK universities were giving endless amounts of evidence as to the effect of the prevent agenda on freedom of speech on campuses, both in terms of protest and student activity, but also student freedom to express themselves in class, to study, to take books out of the library. Because under the prevent agenda, in short, anything, because it has a notion of radicalization, which sees people as being radicalized in this kind of monocausal way, and excessive religiosity as it's seen, or expressing oneself on Palestine, expressing oneself politically while being Muslim, can be evidence of future radicalization. Everything that Muslim background or Muslim looking students in universities said was potentially evidence of future radicalization, which meant that their speech was being constricted in very, very profound ways, not just rendering them reportable under certain reporting procedures and obligations. But if you think about it, the way that they're being essentialized is extraordinary. That everything that you say, if it is excessively political, excessively religious, may be evidence of future radicalization leading to terrorism. So this path-dependent securitarian notion was being used to restrict speech in universities in all kinds of profound ways. And yet that never found its way into the debate on freedom of speech on campus.
Thanks, Gavin. And that reminds me of something actually that I read about Thomas Hobbes, one of the heroes of liberalism. He apparently blamed the English Civil War on universities, teaching the Greek philosophers to students. He called universities the Trojan horse of the nation. So this kind of thing seems to have been going on for a long time, unfortunately. We've got a question that's come in from Chris. He says, following the discussion on the tension between protecting counter-speech and combating speech which is by nature censorious, e.g. mobs, smearing, etc., do you think it's possible to clearly distinguish between these two forms of speech in law or policy? Does anyone want to come in on that?
I can try. I think the main thing I would say is we have to have a very sort of critical and realistic view of what law and policy can do, I think, in this area. And I think when I talked about the sort of expanded notion of freedom of speech, whereby, smears can silence and disproportionate difficulty in accessing platforms can be a form of silencing as well. I think all that is true and is an important part of the picture, but I can't imagine that the law or policy could be much use in combating that kind of thing. So take the example of criticizing Israel. So if I criticize Israel and I get branded an anti-Semite online, and then people don't invite me to things and people don't let me write, what is the law going to do about that? I mean, not that it would want to come to my defense anyway, because that would misstate the kind of entity we're dealing with. But even hypothetically, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing where the law could intervene and make a judgment about whether X constitutes a genuine smear or not, or whether it's just a legitimate objection to speech. I think there are maybe in extreme cases, that's where defamation law comes in. But then defamation law is also not unproblematic at all when it comes to free speech. It tends to be, as far as I understand these things, that the person with the most money wins. So I think there are really strict limits to what the law can do in this area. I think the main thing I would say is that we should be pushing to roll back the criminalization of speech and certain laws that are actually already now impinging on our freedom of speech, including the prevent law, including the upcoming attempt to ban boycotts and divestment motions or speech advocating those possibly. I'm sure there are others that people can mention.
Thanks, Lorna. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question? No, I think I completely agree with what Lorna has said on this. And, this problem is also reflected in the new university's free speech bill that's been proposed, that would fine students' unions for no platforming someone, the rightness or wrongness of that can be debated on another level, but I imagine that those that have had to pay a fine will use this as a sign of success in some way, will crowdfund to as a sort of protest against the rule. So there are real limits on what the law or policies can do to protect against these things. And the same even goes for hate speech laws. Very few people are actually convicted every year for hate speech. It doesn't solve the problem of hate speech. It's a kind of sticky plaster for a much widespread problem that requires a more expansive response. So there are real limits on what the law can do, even with the best intentions.
And we don't have, sorry, I just had a footnote.
Yeah.
We don't have the best intentions at all. I mean, what we have is the point of the free speech bill, as I understand it, is to encourage and empower people, even people who have no stake really in the university, to be able to sue. And of course, we know who's in a good position to sue and who isn't. And what does it mean to say that you can, somebody's no platformed? Am I no platforming somebody now because there's infinite people that I'm not, or nearly infinite people that I'm not inviting to come and speak at my seminar that I don't run? They're all being no platformed, or is it only no platforming if I invite them and then change my mind? The whole thing makes no sense, but of course it's not supposed to make sense, and it will just be applied really selectively in order to hit the targets that the government and well-funded bodies want to hit.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. It is very confusing, and again reflects something we were talking about earlier on public confusion surrounding how these things work in practice. When you look at the statistics for how many people are actually deplatformed every year, it's very small. In some cases, it will have been a bad thing overall for free speech that they were prevented from speaking, but it will be very difficult to rule against that in any meaningful way. Lots of talks, if anyone who works in university will know, fall through for lots of different reasons. A fallout over the budget or booking a room or things like that. And so there are lots of reasons why an invitation might be revoked. Even if it's revoked because of things the person might say, they can just perhaps come up with a different reason as to why it was revoked. We have another question from Mark Hannah, who says it's maybe an unfair question. I know the speakers may be outside the jurisdiction, but I wonder what they think of free speech in Northern Ireland. I suppose I could try and answer that question. What I think of free speech in Northern Ireland, I think that culturally there might be a rather different thing going on in Northern Ireland than the American or even the UK context, in that when it comes to the issues that get a lot of media attention, particularly from the universities, cancel culture type things, those kind of things don't really seem to be happening in the same way here. Of course, there's been a long tradition of really intense public debate in Northern Ireland, and perhaps in that sense, people are more used to difficult public conversations, and so they're perhaps not as censorious in that way, but also there's a long-standing problem of who gets to speak and who is given a platform. And so we still need to look at the way in which there are better or worse ways of running dialogue. Everyone that lives in Northern Ireland knows that this is a problem. So there are a few different things going on in the Northern Ireland case that make it stand out in comparison to the rest. And in terms of the universities, the two universities that we have here, I work at Queen's, and I would love it if the students were a lot more politically active than they currently are. I think that there are lots of things getting in the way of that, and those include the fact that they're struggling with mental health, struggling financially, working several jobs while trying to complete their degree, and all of these other things are the types of things that also limit the quality of discourse that, you know, need to be taken into account when we look at the free speech issue more broadly. So I hope that answers the question. Does anyone else have any thoughts in the Northern Irish context that you would like to add? No? We're coming up to 5:2. I know Sarah has to run, so we can say bye to Sarah now. Do you have any parting words, or do you really need to go?
No, thank you very much for the invitation, and hope to have other opportunity to follow the discussion on free speech and its current condition. Thank you so much,
Sarah.
Bye.
Bye. So we've got a few minutes left and no more questions, so I encourage the audience to add anything at this time if they wish. But the other two, you know, is there anything that you think wasn't covered today, or anything else you'd like to add based on the conversations we've had already?
We did it again, Gavin.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was it paper, scissors, or stone? I don't know. I mean, very, 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 very briefly, and I think it's inevitable that this always kind of comes up at the end of these discussions. But you know, going back to the distinction that Lorna made at the start between a kind of a thin conception of you know, the right to speak, and a thicker conception of what that speech does, and what the speech of particularly situated, you know, sort of people, subjects does. I think that we should try increasingly to ensure that these discussions about freedom of speech embrace, you know, that sort of the positive dimension, not just the negative dimensions of, you know, what are the limits of speech and who may be being restricted or silenced and whom not, but to reconnect the idea of freedom of speech meaningfully to, you know, to democracy and to participation. Means thinking about what it means to actually be able to speak and be heard, or to participate in discussions that are collective, that have some kind of agency. And to do so outside of the, you know, pseudo public corporations that kind of currently structure so much speech and participation for us. So I think there's an enormous amount of discussion to be had about that, which, you know, inevitably always kind of comes towards the end after we've cleared the terrain around why there isn't actually a problem with freedom of speech, or there may be, but it's not the problem that's being, you know, debated in public. But I'd like to see in general much more discussion about, well, how can people's speech be made more meaningful? And there was a very nice pamphlet published about the Gilets jaunes, the protest movement in France by a French writer, Daniel Salnave, who talked about the idea of speech from above and silence from below. That, you know, in the context of France, talking about freedom of speech as a right that defines the nation, you only ever hear the same people talking. The noise of public discourse is actually a form of governmentality. It means that you can't hear the fact that unless they take to the streets and get shot by cops, you know, with tear gas canisters, people are not being heard. So I think, you know, if there is a crisis of freedom of speech, it has to be something that's linked back into a crisis of representative democracy and all of these other kinds of issues, if we're to get further with some of these discussions.
That's a lovely positive note to end with. Lorna, do you have any closing thoughts on all of this? Are you as optimistic as Gavin?
No, I'm not optimistic, no, but on a sort of negative side, I kind of want, I suppose I could end by reiterating that I think we would get further with these conversations about freedom of speech if we let go of the idea of some kind of political neutrality. I think that is the worst enemy of a lot of political discussions. You see it also in schools, the discourse around schools and how they need to be politically impartial and balanced. And you see it in universities, where there's the idea that there should be debates that are had, as you mentioned earlier, on every issue. Well, of course we don't debate every issue. I think it would be helpful if we started from the recognition that there's no such thing as absolute neutrality. You can have two sides on a given issue, but you will have made a non-neutral decision about where the two sides are and where the middle is. And you don't do that for certain issues. You don't do it on flat earthism, and you don't do it on various other issues. So I think just starting from that recognition would be really good. The recognition that when you're arguing about free speech and claiming not to be presupposing anything about the issue in question, whether it's, for example, trans rights or racism or whatever it's about, usually that's not the case. Usually there is some hidden presupposition about what is going on in the actual issue that it would be best to bring to the surface and actually talk about honestly. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think we just need to be very, very skeptical and very cautious of any talk about free speech, because it's usually not really about free speech at all. It's usually just a form of ideological obfuscation that is serving some political agenda, and usually not a very savoury one.
Okay, thank you. I think we're coming towards the end now. We don't have any further questions. I would just like to give a big thank you to all the panellists, Sarah, Lorna and Gavin, for joining me today at Imagine, and for offering lots of insightful thoughts on these issues. And I'd like to thank the audience too for taking part today, and thanks to the theatre for helping out with the tech side of things. So I think we can leave it at that today. Thank you, everyone.